Spending an hour here with us as we talk about designing seed mixes. A little quick seedling ID here for fun. Starting in the upper left corner there. That is, anyone know? Well, then I'll go through them. That one is lead plant up there. Let me get my pointer. We got lead plant there. Which is of course Morphokinescens. This is Western ironweed or prairie ironweed, Vernonia fasciculata. This one is compass plant, Silphium laciniatum, butterfly milkweed. This is Rotibita pinnata, gray-headed coneflower. You see that one is Desmodium canadense, showy tick trefoil. This one over here is Echinacea pallida, a pale purple coneflower. Golden Alexanders, Zizia aurea, and white prairie clover, Dahlia candidum. I thought I'd put some seedlings on here because we're talking about seed designs. The first most important step in doing a reconstruction, I would argue, is what are you going to plant? What species are you going to use? There's also a lot of other important things that need to be determined, but I'm going to try to convince you that your seed choices are most important. Now, you probably wonder why I'm starting with this slide. 4 of the top 10 environmental disasters in U.S. history. Anyone recognize what's shown up here in the upper left? Looks like the Dust Bowl, huh? That's the Dust Bowl. And then this picture here is supposed to show the Mississippi Delta dead zone. This one down here in the lower left is the Exxon Valdez oil spill back in 1989, April of 1989. And then this one on the lower right is the Deepwater Horizon oil breakout and explosion that happened in 2010. These are just 4 of what described as the top 10 environmental disasters in U.S. history. Of course, there's other ones, but the reason I've put these in here is because I was curious to see, again, what society, I guess, thinks about environmental disasters and why. Well, first of all, these 2 up here have a common theme, and I'll get back to that. Of course, these 2 down here as well. But why in the world isn't this on there on the list? When we think about what happened in much of the Midwest, North American continent, when we had prairie, like you see in the center here, in 1840, covering much of Iowa and surrounding state landscapes. We had organisms by the millions and thousands of different species making their home here. And then, of course, they all started to go away. Millions of, bison, of course, there were probably 75, from 50 to 75 million bison in North America. In Iowa, herds of at least 5,000 were seen. We probably didn't have 1 million bison in Iowa. I imagine we probably didn't quite have that many, but certainly tens of thousands, if not 100,000. The Mead's milkweed you saw right there that I just kind of made go away. That one is federally endangered species. There are 8 populations that have been found and recorded since 1980 in Iowa. But I just checked the website, and of those 8, only 2 of those populations still seem to have plants. The other 6, no one's seen any plants there for quite a while. So if you look at it that way, the latest data suggests that we may have 5 plants left in the state. Prairie chickens, of course, by the millions again in North America, and certainly probably by the millions in Iowa. There's historical accounts of people shooting over 300 chickens in one day. A group of hunters killed 1,500 in 3 days. So there were a lot of prairie chickens at one time, and they went extinct. So these first 3 all were extirpated from Iowa. as well as the elk, of course. And elk used to be about 10 to 12 million probably in North America. And early settlers would see anywhere from 200 to 300 elk in herds in the good old days. They're all gone. Prairie rattlesnakes, of course, are gone. Maybe some people don't care too much about that, but the prairie rattlesnakes do. And of course, we still have white lady slipper orchids, but far fewer populations than we once had. So that all because this came on the scene, right? So why isn't this an environmental disaster? I mean, it killed way more organisms than any of those oil spills did. We're talking, millions of different things here, or there should be millions of different individuals, of course, being killed or driven out of the state. It must be because, no one thinks about the prairie that much, or it happens so slowly and so without really being noticed until it was all gone. It really wasn't recognized as the environmental disaster that it really was. I always think that I wish that there would have been someone like John Muir walking around Iowa back in the mid 1800s and someone who could really appreciate what was being lost and advocating for, let's just set a few pieces, just a square mile, every so often, set that aside. If that had been done, we would really have some treasures. But that wasn't done. So we are to this state now, prairie conservation and restoration. What do we do? What do we do about that? Well, certainly the most important thing, without a doubt, is finding and protecting whatever remnants we can have, that we still have and we can find. Those are the real thing. And those give us the model that we need to have in order to do a good job in reconstructing prairie, which is going to be the next thing. But when you think about taking care of the remnants, again, what I'm trying to show here is that ecologists have sort of two ways of thinking about restoration. There's two ways restoration can happen. Restoration is the big umbrella that just simply means bringing native ecosystems back onto the landscape. We can do that by protecting remnants and improving them. So that's what prairie renovation means. Prairie renovation is like, renovating an old dilapidated house or something. You're going to fix it up. We can fix up these remnants. And that's what we should be doing, of course, because they're very important. They're the original source of genes for the prairie species that, again, lived here. But there's only a limited amount of prairie that can be recovered there. We're not going to be able to use prairie renovation as a way of really, getting back to anything that looks like that sea of prairie that used to be here, and early pioneers would describe as ocean waves of prairie as they looked out across that expansive landscape. So, it can't do very much to bring very much prairie back because there's just not very much of it there. But it is very important, as I'm saying there, in terms of its contribution to conservation because of, again, that important knowledge that it brings to us about prairie biology and, again, the relationships among prairie species. So since that is the number one thing to do, but since we can only bring so much of the prairie back or attain, a limited amount of prairie, then the other thing we have to do, of course, is to rebuild the prairie landscape, to put it back out there. And that's, of course, is what prairie reconstruction is. And that's the focus of tonight, because prairie reconstruction happens because we put seeds out on the landscape. And it truly is, in a theoretical sense, at least, unlimited in terms of the contribution to prairie conservation it can make. If we had the financial wherewithal and the political wherewithal, we could plant a lot of prairie and we could get large tracts of prairie. Now, of course, it would be the reconstructed prairie, which of course is not the same as the remnant prairie, but it's close if you do it right. So we've been doing prairie reconstructions for quite a while. The very first prairie reconstruction at Curtis Prairie at the University of Wisconsin Madison Arboretum was in 1936. So we're coming up on almost 90 years or so of reconstruction. Of course, the first maybe 20, 30 years, there wasn't a whole lot going on. It certainly has picked up though. And so I think, it should be said that we know a lot about prairie reconstruction. We should know a lot about how to do it, how best to do it. There are journals out there that are focused on restoration, but I'm not sure that we do know so much about it because of what I see often in my work over and over and over again as I do field research across Iowa and other surrounding states. I see many examples of prairie reconstructions that were not done very well. So we need to fix that. I'd say there's probably these 4 important principles of doing a prairie reconstruction. And this is, again, really looking at just one aspect I'm going to be talking about is the seed design. Yeah, there's other things about, well, do you plant in the spring? Do you plant in the dormant season? How do you prepare the soil? Do you need to, how are you going to kill the existing brome? Or how are you going to do this? How are you going to, deal with weeds? Those are all the logistics of, of actually putting the seed in the ground and preparing the seed bed. And again, we do know a lot about that. And that's where maybe a lot of focus has been. From my experience, there are some things there that might provide a better opportunity for success, you might say. For example, how you prepare the seed bed, or when do you actually put the seed out there. But I've done enough prairie plantings and done them under quite a few diverse situations and at different times. And it's always true that those prairie seeds grow. So I'm not sure that, it is important to know that and to think about that, but I don't think it's as critical, again, as what you choose to plant. So what you choose to plant, obviously we should be planting native species. That should go without even, a second thought. But to do that, you have to know what those species' natural biogeographical range is. You can't assume just because a species is on a list for a particular state, for example, that that's an appropriate species for you to plant. It should also, of course, be an appropriate habitat, because prairies run the gamut from very wet prairies to very dry prairies to prairies that are completely open in the sun to having no canopy cover to prairies that are hidden underneath a maybe 50% canopy cover, something we would call a woodland, or even a little bit more open, we would call a savanna. Local ecotype has been batted around a lot, of course, and if you talk to anyone about planting prairies and seeds, you've probably heard this term before. It is something that's important. There's no doubt about that. The problem has always been is no one really defines what that means. What is a local ecotype? That's the problem. And I think now with what we're seeing all around us in terms of changing climate and precipitation patterns and drought and winds and tornadoes and derechos, the climate change that is inevitable in front of us, we need to be thinking about planning for resilience of these plantings as well. There's certain climate change in our future. So these are some things I want to talk about. And in order to do that real well, I want to try to just set the stage a little bit, give you some background information. I'm going to try not to take too long with some of these background slides. But this first one is just thinking about this question: how will global climate change affect Midwestern environments? The Iowa Climate Panel, I guess you would call it, a group of Iowa scientists who come out every single year with an Iowa climate statement. I think they've been doing this since about 2011 or 12 or something like that. A couple years, 2017, they came out with this one on humidity, showing data that clearly shows that over the course of the years shown here from 1970 up to 2015, or 2017, I guess, right there it is, we see a very clear increasing trend for humidity, certainly in spring and in summer, somewhat in the winter as well, a little more variation there though, a little more flat in the fall. But increasing humidity is a certainty because of just, again, the physics of water vapor. When the atmosphere is warming, when the earth is warming, more water vapor can be held by the air because the saturation vapor pressure goes up. So that's something we can expect, of course. And then in 2019, they came out with this one about dangerous heat to be more frequent and severe. The increase in the number of days above 90 degrees by 2050. You see sort of what the historical trend is, about 23 days hit that range above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with the low emission scenario, it's going to jump up by, 34 days at least. High emission scenario, a few more, another 11 days. So more days, certainly with high temperatures above 90 degrees and more humidity. Now, things that we tend not to really enjoy too much in Iowa in the summertime. But another important article that is worth taking a look at is this one here by Weebles and Hale. They're looking at climate change projections for the Midwest, and they run a variety of models in order to do this. And this first bit of data here I'm sharing with you is what their models show in terms of changes in temperature. Again, we're talking about here, we're talking about the changes in the Midwest by the end of the century, pretty much by 2090. And the change in temperature is for the average season maximum temperature. What's the average seasonal maximum temperature? And so what we're seeing here is under two different scenarios, two different models, because again, it's, modeling climate change and predicting climate change is very difficult. There's just a lot of complexity to it, lots of feedback loops. But what they come up with is sort of the low range. We see temperatures here, again, looking at the change in temperature. This is the average season maximum temperature, always going up 3 to 6 degrees in the summer, but at the extreme, as much as 8 to 11 degrees. And this is Celsius, mind you. Celsius, 1 degree of Celsius is about 1.8 degrees change of Fahrenheit. So if you convert this to Fahrenheit, it's even more warming than what you might recognize when it's expressed like this. So again, and you see that different seasons have different amounts of change too. It's not going to be the same year round. Different seasons will behave in different ways, but again, all of them going up. The next data again show the range, again, given these different models of the percent change in precipitation by, again, either decreasing for winter here. In some scenarios, it's going to decrease by 5%. Other scenarios, it increases by as much as 30%. So that one encompasses 0, so it could go either way a little bit. Here, it looks like for sure, springs are going to have a lot more precipitation, 0 to 40% increase. Summer, it leans a lot more strongly to a decrease in precipitation during the summer, so more droughts in the summer. And autumn is kind of a balance. It's a wash. Could go 20 up or 20 down. So what we can say for sure, just looking at this, is that for sure temperatures going up, humidity going up. It looks like there's an increase in winter spring precipitation, decrease in summer precip. But again, it's way more complex than this, and that's what all of this data here is trying to show you, is that there's just so many other factors that are going on here. For example, this is happening, of course, because an increase in CO2 in the air, and so that should be sort of an enrichment, sort of a fertilization for plants, at least, because plants utilize CO2 to do photosynthesis. That would imply that there could be a favoritism then for C3 photosynthesis plants, which of course is not what we really want when we're thinking about some of our exotic C3 grasses that are problems. But lots of prairie species, in fact, most prairie species are C3, all of those forbs. What this suggests is, this could be something that favors the non-native cool season invasive grasses over the C4 grasses. But there's a big but here, because also what's going to be happening with climate change is an increase in the amount of ozone. And that is a stressor on plants, causes stress on plants. So this increased fertilization may not really actually materialize because of more stress. It's clear we're probably going to have longer growing seasons. The last frost will happen sooner in the year, and the first frost will happen later in the year. Increased soil moisture in winter and spring is pretty certain. Again, decreases in soil moisture because of the rain, basically in the autumn. Higher evapotranspiration throughout the year. Well, that means, again, that's more of a stress on plants because evapotranspiration, of course, takes water away from plants and forces them to close their stomata down, which, of course, means that they can't do as much photosynthesis. Same thing with decreased precipitation to evaporation ratio. That's not going to be favorable for plants, especially if that ratio is way less than 1, as they're predicting. And so there's lots of things that can go on here. And again, the point is that it's hard to say for sure. And so, we know that it's going to be a lot more variable. But some other things that are related to climate, but come in forms of other ways: increased winter survival of pathogens and pests, increased northward migrations of invasives and pests, and of course, increased precipitation intensity. The point I want to make here is that there's certainty in terms of something, climate change is going to happen. But in order to really say how it's going to happen at point A or point B or point C, we really can't say that. So what I think we have to be ready for in terms of resilience for prairie plants is just increased extreme range and stress in the climate. So again, even making them even better prairie plants than they already are. The prairie has always been that way. The prairie has always been a very climatically difficult environment. That's why there aren't very many trees. Drought, stress, heat, wind, fire, lots of things that pose problems for plants. Just going to get more that way. All right. Another thing to point out, I want you to understand a little bit about, is this slide here, which addresses, well, how in the heck do plants really respond to environments? Because that's what we're talking about, helping them respond to these drastic changes in environments which seem to be coming our way. I shouldn't say seem, are going to come our way. And really, there's two important things here. And you've probably heard about these, I imagine. First one is that plants respond to environments over evolutionary time, number one there. That means that there's an adjustment in the populations of plants to become better suited to the environment, but it happens over generations of time. It takes a while for that to happen. That's what is called an adaptation. I always get a little bit annoyed when people talk about, the climate change is coming and that we're going to have to adapt. Well, yes, humans can adapt, but you can't adapt. I can't adapt. Adaptation doesn't happen at the individual level. My goodness, adaptation happens at the level of populations, and it takes generations of time. Yes, there's likely to be something that's pushing us to make adjustments so we are better suited to this new climate coming, but we can't adapt ourselves. Our species can, but an individual cannot. And again, this is important because this is the primary way that any species has become what it is today. The adaptations that it has evolved over generations of time. And of course, for adaptation to happen, you have to have this mix of, like a little cartoon shows here. There has to be genetic variation in the population because that's the ultimate sort of resource that species have to prepare them and to help them and actually enable them to be able to adapt. There's going to be competition in order for adaptation to happen because what that means is that there's competition for resources. Not every single individual is going to be able to get as much as it would like to have. And so some individuals are going to have competitive stress. And because of that, some are going to kind of be more likely to be losers and some to be more likely to be winners. And again, in this scope of environmental variation, because natural selection happens. Natural selection is nature making a choice on who gets to live and who doesn't, because who happens to be, again, better suited for the environment over others who are not so suited for the environment because of their genetic makeup, because of their genes. So again, a person cannot adapt. What will happen is the species will adapt. And what that means is that some of us will die and some of us will live. because natural selection will make that choice. But when that happens, then that leads to this thing called differential reproductive fitness, which again is some species surviving and reproducing and passing those genes that help them do that along to offspring, and other individuals that didn't have the right genes, those are the ones that die, and those genes don't get passed along to the next generation. That's what causes adaptation, or in other words, microevolution. That is the big picture in terms of, long-term adjustments. But plants have a trick up their sleeve, especially plants. Plants have another tool in their populations, and really sort of in their, well, within their species, I guess is a good way to say it. And that is that they can also respond to environments in ecological time. This is an adjustment that happens in an individual's own lifetime. This is called acclimation. We can acclimate too. We acclimate when we go to a high elevation place like Colorado and we're hanging out there for a few days. We're going to acclimate by producing more red blood cells so that we can carry more oxygen to our cells. Because what we've done is we've moved ourselves into an environment where the partial pressure of oxygen is less and less oxygen diffuses into our lungs. So we have to have more red blood cells to make up the difference. Acclimation happens at the individual level, and it's something that will also be reversed if the environment changes back. So when you come home from Colorado, you're going to lose those red blood cells. By the way, that's how you, of course, run a super fast marathon, is go out to Colorado for a while and then come back and run a marathon right away, while you still have all those extra red blood cells. A great example of acclimation, there's lots and lots of examples, but the sort of the textbook example, and one that we study in ecology classes, is the difference that we see in trees like oak trees and their sun and shade leaves. This is a single individual. All of its tissues have the same DNA, but yet somehow these shade leaves are much different than those sun leaves. Here's just 4 characteristics and how those shade leaves and sun leaves are clearly different. We can do statistical tests and show that they definitely are different. Well, what's happening is the tree, the individual tree, is acclimating by producing leaves that are better suited to do photosynthesis in the environment that those leaves happen to be in. And it's certainly true that a leaf that's in the sun has to be equipped differently to do photosynthesis and be successful than a leaf that's in the shade. But here's the thing you have to remember. The ability to be able to acclimate and make this adjustment in a shorter time frame, an individual own lifetime, this is again what's important, because this is a way for plants to respond in their own lifetime much more quickly than over generations of time. Adaptation has to happen over long periods of time. This can happen in your own lifetime, but this is an adaptation as well. The ability to acclimate is an adaptation that plants have evolved. The actual acclimation process, again, is different because it's an adjustment over a shorter time frame. The ability to acclimate is, again, an adaptation. So we come back to adaptations being very important. And what that means is genetic variation is very important. It is very important that species have genetic variation to work with. It's going to help them adapt over longer time frames. It's also going to help them be able to acclimate. Okay, what's this notion about local ecotypes? What is an ecotype? Because that is another big part of designing a seed mix. So it's a simple concept, pretty much. It's not a hard one to understand. As it says there, an ecotype is, it's really a subpopulation, because we're talking about a segment of a population, a subpopulation that has adapted to the local environment that it's in, and has, because of that, has sort of started to go in a slightly different evolutionary direction than the rest of the population. So, for example, you could just simply draw it like this. Species A, gene pool. What this means is, what a gene pool is, of course, is the total genetic diversity found within a population or a species, really within a species. And so it means all of the different alleles, which are the different forms of genes that have accumulated in this species over evolutionary time. And of course, all of these different alleles, genes are, again, these are all things that are possible for an individual to have in their genome, because there's this pool of alleles that are out there in the population. A single individual can't have all of them, of course. A single individual can only have two alleles in its genome, two alleles on each of the chromosomes that it gets, one from its mother, one from its father. But there's other alleles out there in other individuals. And again, what this means is that individuals in this population can, through reproduction, through sexual reproduction and having babies, can move those alleles around from individual to individual, and those alleles are available for individuals into the future. Over here, we still have that same gene pool. It's still there and still available to both of these, we might call these subpopulations. I call one A1 and A2, but what I'm trying to show here is that for some reason, a portion of this gene pool now is being isolated and only available to some individuals. This is what is sort of the beginning to a species birth, where a new species might be born. In order for this to happen, but what's happening here is that there's still enough gene flow throughout the entire population that that's not happening. A1 species, or excuse me, A1 individuals can still mate with A2 individuals because they're still the same species. They're just starting to form slightly different gene pools. But for this to happen, again, this has to happen over generations of time, because it happens again as you pass alleles from parent to offspring. It has to have some type of at least slight reproductive isolation. Something has to be preventing these individuals from mating with each other, because that's, and causing some limited gene flow. That's how the gene pools start to diverge a little bit. There has to be natural selection involved here, and there has to be some microevolution going on as well. Have there been ecotypes? Well, of course, there are ecotypes. Ecotype is a concept that certainly is valid. This does happen. The classic study of ecotypes was done here by Klaus, Keck, and Heise back in 1948, when they looked at this species of yarrow that grows from the coast of California up through the Sierra Nevada, over the top of the Sierra Nevada, and down the east side, getting down to the western edge of the Great Basin. And what they did was, the way to study ecotypes is to do a common garden study, where you take seeds or cuttings from plants from different places, as they did here. I think they took seeds from these different spots and they took them back to, let's see, I think they were at Stanford University, took them back to Stanford University and they grew them in a common garden. And the idea is that if the seeds that you grow in a common garden, now those plants are growing in the same exact environment. What you might see if you were to go out and look at these plants is you would see these differences in height at these locations here. When you get up into the mountains here, the plants get smaller. And so if that difference in height, for example, if the difference in the phenotype we see here, if that is maintained in a common garden, then you have evidence for an ecotype, because that's a genetic basis then. That proves that the difference in height is due to the genetic differences in these populations. But if they all grow the same and look similar, then it's not an ecotype, it's probably acclimation. I think, again, and the point I need to make here, I think, because I want to make sure I make it and don't forget to make it, is a lot of what we see and often might interpret as potential ecotypes is probably not ecotypes at all. It's just acclimation. Acclimation, again, right here, acclimation is the ability for individuals to be very plastic with their phenotype. It's also called phenotypic plasticity, because what can happen here again is what you see right here again, the same individual can have very different leaves. We're not going to call those, we know these are the same species, because they come off the same tree, of course. It's the same individual. So the importance here is that they did show that in this gradient of 200 miles, roughly from the coast of California along the Pacific Ocean over to the edge of the Great Basin, is about 200 miles west to east. More importantly, across an elevation gradient of about 9,700 feet, they did find evidence for probably 4 ecotypes. There's one right there. There's another one there. All these short ones are an ecotype. And that's probably one over there on the other side, on the east side of the Sierra Nevada down towards the base. They called them climatic races in their paper, but this was back in 1948. So again, they do occur. It has to happen over really significant amounts of environmental variation. The 200 miles from east to west isn't huge, but what's really important here is the 9,000, almost 10,000 feet of elevation change. If you go up a mountain, basically 1,000 feet up a mountain, roughly the temperature will decrease by 3.5 degrees for every 1,000 feet of elevation gain. So if we're going 10,000 feet, 9,500 feet, that would mean there'd be about 33 degrees of temperature decrease from the lower elevation to the highest, from 980, which is on the coast, to 3,900. These are in meters, 980 meters on the coast and 3,950 meters up here. That's, again, that change is 9,750 feet. To get that same amount of, now you can get the same amount of decrease in temperature, of course, by going north, right? You go further north, it's going to get colder. If you want to get a decrease of 33 degrees, the same as you have right here, going from a lower to higher elevation, by going from point A to point B and going further north to point B, you'd have to go about 1,700 miles. So the 9,700 feet elevation change here is similar to going 1,700 miles away. Now that's clearly a huge leap and clearly going to be a different environment. And remember that number as I talk about the next slide here. The next slide is showing some results from 4 different research papers on ecotypes. And this one over here is the one we just got done talking about. This one is showing again the work of Paulson, Keck, and Heise on Yarrow. But what we see in the middle here now are 3 studies. This one down here is at Texas. What they did here was they grew 4 species of prairie grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, and switchgrass, all in a common garden location in Austin. By getting clones, they went to all different parts of the country, actually about, depending upon the species, but they got clones from 25 to 31 different states. So they covered a large swath of the US, and they brought clones of these species back and grew them in a common garden. And what they use as a measure for whether or not there's an ecotype or not is whether they survived over about a 4-year period. If they didn't survive over a 4-year period, then that would be evidence that that one was too far away and not the right ecotype. But if they did survive over that 4-year period, then that would suggest that, well, there must not be an ecotype there. The next study was done by our friends up at UNI a while back, and they looked at switchgrass and Prairie Collapse grown in northern Iowa, taken from northern Iowa and southern Iowa and grown in a common garden at UNI. They also compared it with some switchgrass taken from Nebraska and South Dakota. And then the third one is these areas right here. It was done by people at University of Minnesota, and they looked at partridge pea. They took populations or seeds from Minnesota, from Kansa Prairie, and from southern Oklahoma, and they did what's called a reciprocal common garden study. They grew them at all the other 3 sites. And what I'm showing you here is basically just to make it as simple as possible what the results are. If there was evidence that ecotypes occur over that distance, you see the arrow is black, like this one right here. There was clear evidence that ecotypes were occurring across that mainly altitudinal change. If the study showed really no evidence of ecotypes. The arrow is red. Now, I have some dashed red ones in here because the people that did the study in Texas, what they found with big blue stem, they found that in some cases, big blue stem could be taken from about 700 miles away, and it grew fine down here. It lived, it survived, which suggests that it's not really any different ecotype. I would not go that far away, though. And they just found that with big blue stem, not with any of the other species. Well, what happened in Iowa? Well, in Iowa, again, no evidence of an ecotype for either switchgrass or Prairie Collapse from those populations from northern Iowa to southern Iowa, a distance of 200 miles. No ecotypes within a 200-mile range. They did find ecotypes for switchgrass between UNI and Holt County, Nebraska. That's a distance of about 300 miles. Also, evidence of maybe ecotypes between UNI and southeast South Dakota here, Union County. That's about 225 miles. The Minnesota people found evidence that there are certainly ecotypes between Minnesota and Kansa. That's going to be about 400 miles. There's certainly ecotypes between Kansa and southern Oklahoma. That's 340 miles. And the Texas people found pretty much evidence of ecotypes for most of those grasses if you got outside of about 300 miles from Austin. So these clear over here, that was an ecotype. Clear up in Wisconsin, that's an ecotype. Clear up in South Dakota, same thing. So it looks like certainly ecotypes do occur, but generally over, again, to get enough variation in environment, I would say you've got to go at least 200 miles. Within 200 miles, not likely. So this notion, and I know that some people, you may have heard people say, "Oh, you got to get a local ecotype within 30 miles." There's no science that backs that up whatsoever, and personally, it's foolish to even think that. All right, so what did happen here, of course, was that we had a huge grassland biome I was a part of. This grassland biome was the largest biome in North America. I think the tundra, the taiga, may have been about similar, but certainly this is bigger than the eastern deciduous forest or any of the desert biomes, any of the Pacific Northwest temperate forest biomes. This is about 1.2 million square miles. And of course, in Iowa, we had about 85% or so of the state covered with prairie. That's the yellow stuff here. Lots of prairie, of course. And so the thing to think about here was that in the native landscape, gene flow just was apt to go just wherever it wanted to go. There was gene flow moving plants, the genes of plants around at will. There was nothing to stop gene flow. By pollen moving, by insects, a little bit slower, pollen moving by wind. And by the way, that's probably why big blue stem seems to have a little bit longer distance in order to get to an ecotype, because it's wind pollinated and the amount of gene flow. Of course, the other grasses are too, but and so again, just when you think about it that way, again, there really is, it's not likely ecotypes are going to be forming in an environment where gene flow is rampant and moving all over the place. Now, of course, what happened is that all that prairie is gone, replaced with crop ground. I have if you can see them, I have I think 5 little yellow dots. They're about as small as I can make a yellow dot, indicating, yeah, there's still prairie out there. A little tiny little tidbit of prairie in this sea of agricultural land. Well, things have changed. Now we have to be concerned about this diagram I have up here that shows the 2 ranges of problems that plants and other species would encounter. Inbreeding depression at one end down here. This means that you're mating with individuals that are too related to you. You're relating with siblings. You're mating with parents. You're mating with individuals who carry pretty much the same genes that you have. That's what that means. On the other end, and you see here that fitness is low here. It goes up if we get away from that and we get more genetic distance between the two parents. But then it starts going down again because there's this other thing called outbreeding depression, which is what happens when, again, individuals are too distantly related in a sense. And what's important here to think about when you're talking about outbreeding depression is that when we're talking about ecotypes, that's the point that people make, is that if you don't use the right ecotype, then outbreeding depression could happen, because again, what you're saying is that two individuals who are kind of genetically going in different directions are now going to be able to mate, and there might be some outbreeding depression involved there because, you know, the offspring are going to be sort of a combination of both of those and won't really maybe have the best genes to do well in that environment. But I want to point out that here we're talking about, again, that happening between two individuals of the exact same species. Those two individuals of the same species, again, do share the same gene pool. You could also argue what outbreeding depression really means is that you're increasing genetic variation. You're bringing genetic variation back into the populations. From that point, outbreeding depression is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. Because what can happen here is in these really tiny fragmented populations, they're going to have tiny little small gene pools. There's no gene flow between these populations. And so these two things, one's called genetic drift, that happens in real small populations. Inbreeding happens in real small populations, again, without any gene flow. Relatives have to mate with relatives. There's no other choice. Those two things are very detrimental to the genetics of a population. And these two things combined can definitely lead to population extinction. That is to me, that is the far bigger threat we have out here in this landscape we're dealing with than any kind of possible inbreeding depression from two individuals of the same exact species. They're the same species, so they have a right to mate. They still belong to the same species. That's this end of the spectrum is far worse than this end. Okay, I want to point out, we're not going to have time to take a break today. I want to point out this because this is really important. I just became aware of this when I attended a seminar by Zoom at Iowa State back in fall semester. We had this Daniel Hernandez presenting, and he is presenting this idea that a few ecologists have, certainly. And by far, from what I can tell, they're in the minority view here. A lot of ecologists think what they're talking about here is a bad idea, and I'm going to try to convince you, yes, it is a bad idea. But what they're talking about is this thing called assisted migration. And what they're saying is, basically here, to put it into just short as I can, that because of climate change, they want to assist species in their migration north, basically. They think that we need to have migration of species, from the south towards the north, because they have this perception that climate change means that, again, in some ways, it's true what we were talking about when we looked at the climate change models. It's going to get warmer. But remember, I said it's going to be really hard to really know for sure what's happening at different places, and there's lots of other things going on. It's really not quite that simple. It's going to get warmer for sure, but again, whether that means more rain, less rain, other kinds of stresses, again, pests coming up from the south, and if you're bringing species up from the south, you're going to probably increase the likelihood of bringing pests up from the south. But what they say, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of what they say in this paper here. They say that local species and seed sources, because they're traditionally used because they are presumably adapted to local conditions. Bingo, you're right. Yes, native species are the best adapted to your site. That's why we want to use native species. And that's why we should not be doing this, because you're bringing species in that are not native. Okay, of course, they would argue, yeah, but we think that it's going to be good because if they could migrate here on their own, they can't now because of fragmentation, they would migrate here. they would naturally get here, and that because the climate would bring them here. That's what they're basically saying. Another thing they claim is local genotypes may be poorly adapted to future climate conditions. There is some truth in that, but they are forgetting how plants respond to environment. They can adapt, and they have this wonderful ability to acclimate, which I think far too many people don't appreciate, don't understand. I feel I have a good appreciation for it because I've been seeing plants for 35 years throughout the Midwest. I have a much better idea of what sort of natural phenotypic plasticity is, I think, than most people. Another point they're making are these unassisted migrations are nearly impossible, again, because of fragmented. Yes, that's definitely true, and that is bad. That connectivity is what's causing, again, these isolated populations to get smaller gene pools and stuff. So yes, we need to do better at connecting these remnants. That just simply means planting more prairie correctly and making corridors to get them connected so that gene flow can happen. It's not a reason to do assisted migration, not in my mind. The black thing they're saying is, so what they propose to do is all future plantings, they're going to take what they've decided is a suitable species that could, again, they're playing Mother Nature here, could reach the planting site in an unfragmented landscape. They're going to assume that if there were still vast acres of prairie, that those species would get there on their own. Well, they didn't get there before on their own, probably because of something that limited them from growing further north. So let's not forget about that. But what I'm saying here, this black thing, that's really taking some big and I think very risky assumptions. The last thing they say here is this green thing. They want to be able to allow in situ adaptation to changing climates. Yes, that is what you should be focusing on. Try to improve the ability for your planting to be able to adapt to changing climates. Don't play Mother Nature and move other species in. The reason, and so here's an example of what they want to do. They want to take rosinweed, which has this range right here. You can see it kind of the northern limit of the range is that purple line. They want to move it up to, again, they're planting up in, they're up near Minneapolis, not at Minneapolis, but a little bit further south. And it's not just Silphium integrifolia. They've identified all of these species as species that, they don't occur in Minnesota now. They're not native to Minnesota, but these are all species. They're going to move to Minnesota because they think that's the right thing to do. This is a bad idea, very bad. And here's a number of reasons why. If you were just thinking about the abiotic environment, which is what climate change is really focusing on, temperature, rainfall, humidity, then maybe you could sort of think about this in a reasonable way. If it was just abiotic, we're just looking about water and light, and that was it. But that's not environments that species have. Environments have a biotic environment that involves huge amount of interactions with all kinds of other species in ways that we don't even completely understand yet. Multiple interactions, 3, 4, 5-way interactions with other species. And so when you move a species into another environment, you ought to be thinking, we got to be careful about this biotic environment. Yeah, maybe the abiotic environment is right for it, but the biotic environment is probably not right for it. I mean, a great example, that's the native range of black locust. That's where black locust behaves like a native species and is a natural part of the ecosystem. I'm sure many of you have run into black locust in Iowa and have discovered it does not behave like a native species. It is one of our most terribly invasive species. Just moving a species native to North America 500 miles into Iowa was enough to make it a terribly invasive species. Can't we learn from this? What the problem here is that they're not taking into account this evolutionary context. You got to have an evolutionary context in order to have species who are properly, should properly grow together. Species develop these interactions through evolutionary time because they are living together and interacting and co-evolving with each other. That didn't happen between Iowa species and black locust because black locust lives down here. So it didn't have that evolutionary context. Another thing that can happen when you move species this far is you're taking away what could be the geographical isolation that keeps it separate from other species. One of the most important reproductive isolation mechanisms is geographical separation. The species can't get together. Individuals of the two species can't get together and mate because they're separated too far by space. When you move them this far, you could be moving a species A into the range of another species of the same genus, but a different species that, again, used to be, they would never mate. You know, under nature, they would never mate because they were too far apart. But now you've moved them into the same range, and now they can mate. That can lead to genetic dilution now called introgression of genes from one species to another species. Here, again, I'm going to pull up this graph because what's happening again here is outbreeding depression, but this is different from the ecotypes because now what we're talking about is an individual from species A putting genes into another individual of a different species, not the same species. We were talking about, when we were talking about this before, we were talking about two individuals of the same species that have a right to reproduce because they are the same species. Two different species, in theory, don't have the right to reproduce because they're different species. But you put them close together and you have this open pollination system that plants have, introgression can happen. That's what causes a hybrid. And again, introgression causes dilution of that species, erosion of the species integrity. Their species gene pools are breaking down. That's not good. Again, lack of evolutionary context. And finally, I think there's an ethical reason not to do this. Because in a sense, you're picking out species and you're saying that you're going to, you're going to have some species you're going to choose, other species you're not going to choose, and there can be a species bias there. The idea of diversion of resources, you're spending money to do this when you could be spending money to really do the planting the right way. And a really important one here is this one, because this whole idea of assisted migration really has its roots not in doing this, not in planting prairies and trying to counter climate change. Assisted migration has its roots in trying to save endangered and threatened species. When we get to a point, that one of the first examples where this really came up was in Florida when people were trying to save a species of plant, and the species escapes me right now, but the species of plant had everything that is happening to cause species to lose habitat, to lose individuals, loss of habitat, chemical pollution. The species was really getting hammered, and it was down to just a few populations of a few individuals, and it didn't look like there was much hope for it in Florida. The idea came up, well, let's take some of these and do assisted migration, help them migrate out of Florida up into, I think it was southern Georgia or southern South Carolina, into habitat that was similar. Again, it was an area that the species never really had, wasn't within the native range of the species, so they were moving it outside of its native range. But you could argue you're doing it because you're at the last thread of hope of saving that species. That's why you would make a decision to do this. We're not at the last hope of saving species. Sulfum integriforum does not need to be moved to Minnesota to help it to save it. And then the other thing, the last thing here is, again, as I kind of inferred, doing this, you're playing Mother Nature, and you're taking a big ecological gamble here. You could be causing another black locust, and so take the gamble to try to make your prairie more resilient because you think this would have happened by nature if nature could do it on its own. That's a big gamble versus what's called the precautionary principle, which basically says don't tinker with nature any more than you have to. Don't play Mother Nature. Okay, so how do I do this? I can finish this up in about 10 minutes. So here's a little planting at my place. So my question here is, here's how you design a prairie for resilience to help rescue the prairie and bring the prairie back and provide a rebirth of prairie, and do it in the right way. Just a 3-step design. Yes, pick species native to your site. They have to be native to your site. Then, of course, pick species that are the right species for the abiotic environment. And then, because I've tried to stress the importance of genetic variation, you select seed sources to help maximize that. So how do you pick species native to your site? You use these range maps, distribution maps that can be found. These maps come from the Iowa prairie plants, which I'll show you in just a little bit. Here's 2 examples of 2 species, butterfly milkweed and Indian grass, that these maps would indicate to me, that should indicate to you or to me, that these 2 species grew everywhere in Iowa. Yes, there's a few counties that show there's no voucher for them. That just simply means none was ever collected. Clearly, this kind of pattern means that this species could be planted anywhere in the state. But that's not always the case. Look at the distribution maps for those 3 species. Here we've got narrowleaf mountain mint. Here we've got yellow Indian paintbrush. Here we've got shooting star. I'm drawing blue lines in here to help you see there's clearly a pattern here that says these species did not occur in the entire state. So you should not be planting narrowleaf mountain mint if you live up here in Kossuth County. You should not be planting Indian paintbrush if you live down here in Ringgold County. We have to pay attention to these. Now, luckily, there's roughly 100 species that are like this. And so there's about 100 species out there that you can't go wrong. You can't be wrong. About 20 grasses and 75, 80 forbs or so that have this distribution. We would call these species that kind of are the base species for the base prairie in Iowa. They don't really tell you anything about where you are in Iowa, because again, these species could be found anywhere in the state. They're the foundation base species. But there's over 300 species that are like this. These are the species that give your prairie the correct signature on where you are, and would allow then your prairie to look more like a native prairie. You have to have some of these signature species in your prairie to make it look like you have the right, that you're doing the right thing, that you're planting a prairie that's actually pretty reminiscent and pretty similar to what was there. Now you have to really pay attention to these, and it helps to get a bigger picture sometimes. And so I suggest using BONAP maps. Here, this is the BONAP map for the cream wild indigo here you see in this picture of mine. And you can see how close what you see in BONAP, which I'm showing the western boundary of its range right there in that red line. It cuts right through northwest Iowa. It matches really close with the distribution from Christensen and Mueller, 1999 Iowa prairie plants. And so you should not take this to mean this is a species that can grow anywhere in the state. Almost anywhere, but not in Sioux County, not in Plymouth County, not in Lyon County. If you live in those places, you should not be planting it. And just one more example here with American vetch. And again, see how far it grows? It covers a huge part of the country, but there's this really pretty sharp line right here. That's it. And that corresponds again to this line right here. So here's that resource, Iowa Prairie Plants. You can get this book, a hard copy of it at these sources right here. You can go online. You can see it online right here. I have found a few mistakes in the online version, and I have told the people at U of I Press about those, and they have fixed those. So that's good. So I'm just saying it's possible that, there could be a mistake that can happen. That's why maybe the hard copy would be better. And then how about right habitat? So here, this is a slide that's kind of going to be a little bit busy, but I'm trying to show it's really real simple in the sense you have to, again, think about the soil moisture of your site. And we can put it on a scale here, really terribly dry, what's called xeric, or medium moisture, mesic, or wet, which would imply a wetland, or again, these two that are kind of in between. And for example, so that's this direction on this box. The vertical direction on this box is one that looks at the light environment. On this side of it, I'm talking about just the amount of light. Like 100% of the light is available on the herbaceous layer, really high light, medium light, mid amounts of light, and then low amounts of light. And that would correspond to an increasing tree canopy cover. It's the trees that are increasing that's causing less and less light in the herbaceous layer. And the herbaceous layer are the species that you're going to be putting into the seed mix. So if you're doing a wetland, then obviously these are the kinds of wetlands that you could be looking at here. These are names for the ecosystems that would be present in really wet environments. Again, hydric environment means that the soil is saturated and there's probably water standing above the soil. It's probably flooded at least at some times of the year. Again, we see, again, we have different kinds of wetlands as we get more and more trees and less light. And the hydrology of that wetland would be a key player as well. What's going to be a key player for the soil moisture are all of, well, I'll get to that in just a little bit. So I'll fill in these boxes here. So you could have different kinds of prairie, from midgrass prairie, which is what would be in a really xeric environment, to different kinds of tall grass prairie and through here. If you were a little bit less light, so 10 to 35% canopy cover with trees, you're in a savanna. So mostly, for the most part, a lot of prairie species, but again, there are going to be some species that are going to be a little more likely to do a little bit better in the little bit greater amount of shading that happens here. And of course, when you get to 35 to 65% canopy cover, which strides 50%, and that's about, middle amounts of light, then we're in a woodland. And if we're down here at 65 to 100%, then we're in a forest. You're probably not going to be doing too much reconstruction here. Most of your reconstruction is going to be right up in here. So soil moisture is an important factor, and these are all the different kinds of physical factors that have an effect on what the soil moisture is. These are things that would help you understand, again, where you are in this gradient here. And then this box over here is some of the other factors that affect the amount of light outside of the tree canopy. It is the tree canopy that's the most important. That's why it's down here. These other factors do affect how much light you're going to have. And then this box over here affects, excuse me, helps to affect how many trees you have, which affects how much shade you have, how often fire occurs, climatic droughts, tornadoes and derechos, which take out trees, herbivory, which can take out young trees. It gets complicated. So what I'm saying is that, again, it takes some thought to do it right. What I do in my plantings is I design a seed mix on an Excel spreadsheet. By listing my species, I get information from Prairie Moon Nursery on the number of seeds there are per ounce for that species. That allows me then to keep track of how many seeds per square feet I'm putting out there. Try to follow some of the guidelines that the Prairie Restoration Guidebook from UNI suggests, which would be probably a total of anywhere from 30 to 40 seeds per square foot. This is my number of ounces I'm going to choose to seed. So this is, when I put this number in, this runs the entire spreadsheet, basically. Determines how many seeds per acre I've got, how many seeds per square foot. I keep track of the percentage each species is contributing to the total seed mix. Here, for the grasses, you can see that right now I've got Indian grass accounting for 30% of the seeds. That might be a little bit high. I might want to take that down, or maybe that's what I want. If I'm planting a wet mesic prairie, Indian grass does better and is more abundant in a wet music prairie than big blue stem. Well, I should have more Indian grass there to make it look real than big blue stem. So I use, again, and the same thing is happening down here for the forbs, I use this a lot to try to get my seed design to a place where the abundances of the seeds that I'm planting is a model or reminiscent of the abundances of the plants that I'm trying to have be there, which again is something that you get from looking at lots and lots of prairies and getting an idea of what are the natural abundances of all these species. Then I need to pick the place to get the seeds. I've already decided these are all species that are native to my site. These are species that are correct for the environment. Now, where am I going to get these seeds? I put out a 150-mile radius circle because that's what I feel is the range for my local ecotype. If I get seeds from 150 miles, that should be good because the ecotype research I just showed you clearly shows that probably about 200 miles is where it starts to become important. So this blue one here, it's just a little bit outside it, but this is Prairie Moon, 160 miles away from me here in central Iowa. This one is Prairie Wildflower up in Spencer, although they're kind of getting into retirement, so may not be quite as available there. I think they still do sell some seeds. This one is Diversity Farms, 75 miles from me. This one is Allen Dan, 55 miles from me. Some other ones, Austin Ball Seeds right here. This is a nursery again, a Shooting Star, I think this one is in southeast Minnesota. And this is Ion Exchange in northeast Iowa. And I put, I'll bring it up real quick. When I get done here, I'll bring it up real quick. Another concern you should have is the answer to this question, which is basically, how well can you trust nursery people? Well, the answer to that is, I'm not sure, because I have seen situations that are kind of frightening, really, in terms of what nurseries will do to sell you seeds. Here is, this is a while back, as you can see, 2006, but a prominent Iowa nursery had this premier prairie mix that they were selling to people. It was advertised as a deluxe, super diverse, incredibly beautiful native wildflower and seed mix for a very affordable price, $60 per pound. It was supposed to be, well, I don't know if they really said. I think it was supposed to be a mesic prairie mix, although I don't think they really said. So I did analysis of it, and in the forbs group, there were 3 forbs that were not even native to Iowa. There were 5 forbs that I would say are woodland or forest species, not even prairie species. There were 4 that were marsh or fen species, and not a prairie species. There were 4 that were really dry prairie species. I'm talking really dry, like sand or gravel prairie, xeric prairie species, and probably not, again, right for a mesic prairie. And there were at least 6 species that have this restriction, biogeographical restriction, that again are not native to the entire state. It would only be appropriate if, for wherever they are. You have to pay attention to those. So what I'm saying here is that 22 of these 66 species, a third of the seed mix was bad, not right. And this is what you'd be buying. So what I suggest is, it's hard to figure out, if the nursery is, how well they're treating you, I guess. They don't care too much about, again, if it's the right species for you. They want to sell it to you, plain and simple. What I would check is, make sure that they sell seed as pure life seed. So when you do buy seed, you're getting seed and not trash. Are they using scientific names? That at least tells you that they are trying to make sure that the identity of the species is clear, because common names can be very confusing. I had a situation one time with a nursery that was, we said we had June grass. We had the scientific name too, but we also had June grass as a common name on the seed mix. And they ended up giving us Kentucky bluegrass, because Kentucky bluegrass at one time was called June grass. Do they have information about where this seed's coming from? It would help. What I'm saying here is it might help to do a little bit of investigation, to ask some questions. So there's a list of resources, and that's it. Hope I've sort of convinced you that if you want your reconstruction to look right, if I was doing a wet music site in central Iowa, I want it to look like Doolittle Prairie. It's not going to happen unless you make an effort to do it right. So that's it. There is at the end of the handout that Lance sent you, there is a handout that I got from, it's a PDF that Tallgrass Prairie Center has available. You can find it yourself at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I just downloaded it as a PDF and attached it to this handout, which gives a really long list of a lot of seed and prairie materials and even prairie work providers in Iowa. So that's something you might want to take a look at to help you locate people who can help you, people that sell seed. But with that, that's all I've got. Thanks for coming. Looks like there's no questions in the chat, huh?
I got two, I think. So what are examples in Iowa of sand and limestone savannas?
You want examples of species to plant there, or examples of where they are, or what do you mean?
I think examples of where they are.
Oh, where they are?
Yeah.
So sand prairies are commonly found in the eastern half of Iowa along river valleys that could be used. It's usually kind of on the eastern side of river valleys. I've seen some on the west side though. And what happens is sand from the floodplains of those river valleys, sand gets deposited in flooding events, and then sand blows off of those river valleys up into the uplands and accumulates into sand dunes basically. And yeah, so there's a number of sand prairies. They're not big, they're smaller in size generally. They're somewhat restricted because they are kind of a unique aeolian feature of the landscape. It's just where this kind of drift of sand happened to end up. And unfortunately, this is just another example of bad, I should say bad, a lack of understanding by conservation-minded people. A lot of the sand prairies have been planted with pines because conservation people have thought, well, that sand out there, there's not much growing out there, so we need to improve it for wildlife. So we know that we can plant, pine trees will grow on sandy soil, so let's plant pine trees. Plant the pine trees out on those sand prairies, and that will be better for wildlife because now there's trees growing there. So a lot of our sand prairies got planted and covered up by pine trees. Gravel limestone prairies are most commonly found up in the Iowa erosion surface. So that's kind of the northeastern part of Iowa, but not way up in northeast Iowa. Floyd County, a great place to see that would be Floyd County. The Fossil Prairie Park has got some great limestone prairie there. But over also in Clinton County, Manikowski Prairies, a state preserve. So you'll find again where limestone is outcropping has to be limestone, bedrock near the surface. So it's got to kind of be in that Silurian escarpment area, so to speak. So there's a geological component. You have to be in the right place, geologically speaking. But if you want, send me an email. I can actually give you some actual names of places to go.
Right. The other question is, can you plant new plants in an established prairie?
Oh, yes. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that. I would say when you're doing, so what we're talking about, is it appropriate to plant species in a prairie renovation? So I think that's what he's asking. So you've got a remnant prairie, it's a remnant, figured that out somehow. Is there to improve it? I would say yes. Some people would disagree with me on that, but I say yes, you can, but only after very careful thinking and study, and some time to see what shows up there. Get a really good list of what's growing there. Have a professional survey done if necessary to get that, so you know what's growing there, how much is growing there. Here's a quick example. I work a lot with White Rock Conservancy. They use me as an ecological consultant a lot, and there's a There's a gravel prairie there. It's a small little cane that has some populations of some species that grow in gravel prairies for sure, and are sort of at their, well, for Guthrie County or Carroll County, probably the only place in the whole county where those species grow. And I'm suggesting to them that for a few species, and Penstemon grandiflorus is one of those species, the population of it there is not doing real well, but it's clearly a native species there. And it doesn't, again, it's no other populations that we know of in the county. I would say once you can ascertain that there is a really good reason to supplement a population or add a species to a population by planting seeds in a remnant, I think it's fine, because I think what you're trying to do is we're trying to reconnect prairie. We're trying to lessen the strain on small population sizes. We need to build population sizes up, increase the genetic variation. When you plant seeds from someplace into a remnant prairie that already has some of that species, you would be helping to increase the genetic variation there. So I just want to caution that it needs to be done after, again, a lot of careful and meaningful thought about what you're doing. And, you have to convince someone like me, I guess, that it's the right thing to do. But I'm saying it can be the right thing to do.
Okay, I think that's all we got right now.
All right. Well, great. I hope this was helpful to you. Next week, we're off. In 2 weeks, I believe it's idea of one of those tough families. Well, it's not a real hard family, but it's going to have a lot of species, the Rosaceae. All right. Well, have a good evening.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Bye.